much, all of you, for coming today. I'm Shihoko Goto. I'm the Senior Associate for Northeast Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia program. For those of you who have not been to a Wilson Center event before, welcome. Just a few words about our organization. We were established in 1968 as an act of Congress as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Because we are partially congressionally funded, we are nonpartisan. We are very proud of that distinction as a think tank, especially in this day and age. This is now day 5 of a new administration, and there have been many changes. And there have really, changes is probably too loose a word. We've seen seismic shifts in how the United States sees itself, how the United States is perceived by the world, and how the United States will position itself in a global order. But perhaps one of the biggest changes in the foreign policy front is the United States' relationship with Taiwan. It started, as we now know, since December 2nd with the phone call from brought about the question about the prospects for the One China policy. It has impacted cross-Strait relations, and it has really brought back Taiwan's issues related to Taiwan back into the forefront of the American public. For Taiwan, this could actually be a mixed blessing. Future U.S. actions regarding Taiwan, there are so many of us here who follow these issues very closely, but there is a lot of concern that Taiwan can be vulnerable to further retaliation from Beijing. But today, our focus is going to be not about the United States relations with Beijing, but more about the latest developments in Washington's relations with Taipei itself, and what it means for Taiwan, and what that means for Taiwan's political identity, economic security, as well as military security. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you some of the most thoughtful leading experts on the issues. We're going to begin the discussion today with Shelley Rigger, who is the Brown Professor and Assistant Dean for Educational Policy at the Political Science Department of Davidson College. She is also the author of Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse, and I know we're all waiting for a new edition of that book. We will then ask comments from Dennis Hickey, who is the James F. Morrow Endowed Professor of Political Science and Director of the Graduate Program in Global Studies at Missouri State University. And we will wrap up with Peter Chow, who is a professor of economics at the City College of New York's Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. But before Shelley begins, I would like to invite the Asia Program's Director, Ambassador Stapleton Roy, to share maybe one thought about where we stand before we start off with Shelley. Thanks, Dave.
I didn't realize I was being restricted to one thought. Maybe a tweet. Our topic today is U.S. Taiwan relations, prospects for security and economic ties. Frankly, we can't talk about the issue intelligently at the moment because U.S. Taiwan relations are directly related to U.S. mainland relations. And if the U.S. mainland relationship is disrupted, then the U.S. Taiwan relationship is affected. So This is the first time the one China policy has been in play for decades. There was one point in 1995 when the United States reversed itself on the question of whether or not the president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, would be permitted to make an unofficial visit to the United States to visit his old alma mater of Cornell. And we had assured the Chinese at the Secretary of State level that he would not be permitted to come. And there was a resolution in Congress, non-binding, saying he ought to be permitted to come, and the administration reversed itself, and China began to fire missiles into the Taiwan Strait area. And they made a fundamental change in their handling of the Taiwan issue. Because from 1979 until 1995, the Chinese had never threatened to use force against Taiwan. They had reserved the right to use force because it was potentially a nation-splitting issue, and they thought that they had the right to use force. But essentially, the reversal of the Clinton administration's position caused them to lose confidence that the United States would hold firm on a one-China policy. They suspected that we were going through the back door to give a greater measure of officiality to the relationship with Taiwan, which would be inconsistent with the official relations with the mainland. And so they substituted for their loss of confidence in the U.S. one-China policy the threat to use force against Taiwan. So that illustrates why the one-China policy is directly relevant to the question of handling our relations with the two sides of the strait. The one-China policy is not an American invention. It's a Chinese invention. Until October 1st, 1949, we only had one China. But then, at the near conclusion of the Chinese Civil War, we had the People's Republic of China declaring itself to be the sole legal had the temporary capital in Taipei. And they took the position that there was only one legal government of China, and that was in Taipei. Fact that up to the present time, we still don't have a formal conclusion to the Civil War. And we still have two competing Chinas claiming to be the government of one China. And no country has been successful in establishing diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level with one and retaining official relations at the ambassadorial level with the other. But the one China policy in terms of its application took time to develop. I was in the American Embassy in Taipei as a very junior officer in 1964 when I was suddenly pulled loose from my duties and given access to secret cables that were so sensitive that I was never permitted to see them. And they were coming in such numbers that the ambassador and the DCM couldn't handle them. And so they wanted me to sort of keep track of all these secret cables. And they had to do with the decision of de Gaulle to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At the time, France had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan. And it was a strange thing because until that moment, Western governments, by and large, did not have ambassadorial relations with Beijing. They had chargé-level relations. The British were a special case. They weren't permitted to have an ambassador because they kept a consulate on Taiwan. And the mainland was not prepared to let them have an ambassador. But many of the Western European governments still hadn't established formal relations with the PRC. And those who had were at the French planned to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. But de Gaulle would not agree, as part of the communique, to say that France recognized Beijing as the sole legal government of China, which showed that it was so important to China that while they didn't include it in the communique, they intended to make it clear that this was the basis on which the relationships had been formed. But this was partly a game between Beijing and Taipei, because Taipei had a one China policy, and therefore, if France established diplomatic relations with China, Beijing wanted Taipei to break relations with France. And in fact, that's what happened. February 10th, 1964, when the announcement of the French diplomatic relationship with Beijing was announced, Chiang Kai-shek terminated diplomatic relations with France. So that's an illustration of how the one China policy is fundamental to whether you have official relationships with Beijing or with Taipei. We have three joint communiques with China. The first one, the Shanghai Communique, we didn't recognize Beijing as the sole legal government of China. As a result was we didn't have a diplomatic relationship with China after the Nixon visit in '72. The liaison office was not a diplomatic office. I've been reading some articles, sensible articles that talked about how we had near normal relations with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. This is total nonsense. We did not have near normal relations with Beijing during the period of the liaison office, and anyone who served in the liaison office would know that. We had highly constrained relations with the mainland, and we had full diplomatic relations with Taipei. But in the normalization communique, we recognized Beijing as the sole legal government of China and acknowledged the Chinese position that Taiwan was part of China. Difference between recognizing and acknowledging. Same language was repeated in the August 17, 1982 joint communique having to do with arms sales to Taiwan. They just quoted the same language from the normalization communique. Now, something that many China specialists don't know, the joint communiques were not signed. They were merely statements. And the three communiques were issued by three separate administrations. Shanghai Communique by the Nixon administration, normalization by the Carter administration, and the arms sale communique in '82 by the Reagan administration. So what was said as statements of administration policy didn't have the force of a treaty. So it didn't carry over from one administration to the next. So every new U.S. administration firm that our relationship with China will be based on the three communiques. And in the American case, we add, will also be based on the Taiwan Relations Act, which is domestic legislation related to this, and the 6 assurances, which were 6 assurances given to Taiwan just before we concluded the August 17 arms sale communique in 1982, which put restrictions on our sales of arms to Taiwan. Why do I say this? Because Mr. Trump, our president, has said he doesn't see why he has to be bound by a one China policy. Everything's negotiable, and this will be out there along with trade and other types of issues. Well, that's an untenable position, quite frankly. He won't get a new ambassador in Beijing if he sticks to that position. He won't be able to have serious substantive negotiations with any issue with China until he clarifies his position on the one China policy. So this is not a trivial issue, and it's creating chaos in Taiwan. Why? Because the status quo which President Tsai Ing-wen is committed to preserving, is based on the one China policy being in place. Take that away, and all of a sudden, you have uncertainty in the U.S. official relationship with Beijing and the potential of retaliation by Beijing against Taiwan. And it comes at a moment when there's already tension in the cross-strait relationship because of Tsai Ing-wen's refusal formally to endorse the '92 consensus, which was the way that the two sides of the strait had appeared to agree on a one China policy, although Taiwan always said there was a different interpretation of what the one China policy meant. Beijing doesn't add that, but it doesn't contradict it when it's said by Taiwan. So that's what the '92 consensus was. So we have this uncertainty now. Previously, it was only related to Tsai Ing-wen's position, but now all of a sudden, the American president is saying, raise the question whether he's prepared to base our relationship with China on this one China policy. That has to be clarified before we can answer the questions that we're going to be discussing today. So that's my introduction to this topic. There are lots of very important considerations. We already are having strains in the economic ties between the mainland and Taiwan because of the failure by Tsai Ing-wen to affirm the '92 consensus. The issue of arms sales to Taiwan will become much more sensitive for Beijing if the one China policy hasn't been reaffirmed. And so these two elements, which are the focus of our comments today, are really very much in play until we see how the Trump administration is going to get over this hurdle that they have created in the relationship with Beijing. So against that background, let me turn it back over to my fellow panelists.
Thanks so much, Stabe. If we can have Shelley share her first thoughts on it, if you could pull up the microphone.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this moment on this topic, which is so very important, and I think Ambassador Roy has given us an excellent introduction to why it is so important. So I'm going to try and move through some ideas quickly. I was asked to begin with the question of why Taiwan matters, and as an author, any opportunity to plug your book is a good opportunity, so of course I would never pass it up. So I wrote this book, Why Taiwan Matters, as a response to my concern that Taiwan might be either forgotten completely or objectified. And something that is very important to Taiwan's recent history is the discovery of Taiwan's own, what Taiwanese call subjectivity, right? The idea that Taiwan is not just a pawn in a larger game or a means to the end of others, but is the subject of its own history and should be the master of its own fate. And the last thing I think anyone in Taiwan and anyone who values Taiwan and the 23 million people who live there would want is to see Taiwan lose its subjectivity and return to the position of an object. So when I was writing about why Taiwan matters, that was the thought that I had in mind, how to persuade people to allow Taiwan to have its subjectivity. Taiwan is always objectified by the PRC, that goes without saying, and I never expected to persuade anyone in the mainland, that Taiwan should be a subject in its own right. I was really speaking to an English reading audience in this book. Taiwan faces incredibly difficult challenges and circumstances as it seeks to retain mastery over its destiny, as it seeks to remain a subject in the world. The guardrails that it has to steer between are very tight. The threats it faces are very real. So I think one way to kind of understand Taiwan politics since the 1990s is as a process of identifying a safe course between these guardrails that both preserves Taiwan's security and prosperity and also preserves Taiwan's autonomy and subjectivity. So Taiwan has kind of settled on this strategy that tries to avoid confrontation with the PRC, but also refuse to accept the terms of surrender that have been put forward by the Beijing government. So sometimes they push a little harder, sometimes they drive a little closer to one guardrail. Li Denghui, Chen Shui-bian steered a little bit more in that direction. Other times it has steered a little bit closer to the other guardrail, that Ma Ying-jeou reset the course of Taiwan somewhat differently. But this has been the task for Taiwan and its leaders, and they have managed this task very well. It's 68 years now that Taiwan has been finding its way through this narrow passage, and it is still autonomous. It is still writing its own story and still the master of its own fate. I think Taiwan's presidency, for all that people worried about it before it began, is firmly within this tradition. She, too, is navigating a course that steers between these guardrails. It's not the course that the leadership in Beijing would prefer, but it is tolerable to the leadership in Beijing. They may say sometimes it is intolerable, but they are tolerating it today, so it is tolerable. It is also this path that Tsai Ing-wen has charted, not what all Taiwanese would prefer, but it is tolerable to them as well. This is not a path that she arrived at capriciously or overnight. She's been working at least 5 years and actually much longer to find a line that will carry Taiwan through. And what she settled on was a commitment to the status quo, as Ambassador Roy says, by which she means avoiding confrontation and provocation with the PRC, but not allowing Beijing to dictate the terms of their relationship. And I would even go so far as to say that what I just said is the Taiwan consensus, that as much as there is disagreement about exactly how to do those two things, avoid confrontation and provocation, while not allowing Beijing to dictate the terms of the relationship, so we can argue about how to a consensus preference of Taiwan's people. And I see all of this in grave danger, partially from the PRC, which will seize the opportunity presented to it by a change in US policy to make the US to blame for the actions it takes potentially against Taiwan. But ultimately, I think the greatest danger Taiwan is facing is centered right here in Washington, D.C. Taiwan is a factor in US-China relations, but it is not only a factor in Taiwan relations. And the attitude of the incoming administration is, I would argue, to return Taiwan to a position of an object and to erase Taiwan's subjectivity by, through overconfidence, wishful thinking, and poor execution, undermining Taiwan's security. Just briefly, what do I mean by overconfidence and wishful thinking? This is an analytical position that assumes that any action that frustrates, thwarts, or weakens the PRC therefore benefits, elevates, or strengthens Taiwan. And that is just not true. Taiwan's relationship with the PRC is complex and interdependent. On the economic front, a tremendous amount of economic value. Taiwan is the source of a tremendous amount of added value in the Chinese economy. So, for example, if the U.S. slaps tariffs on Chinese imports, it will be damaging Taiwanese companies and the Taiwanese economy as much as it will be damaging Chinese companies and the Chinese economy. Killing the TPP was the most consequential harm the Trump administration could have done to Taiwan. I think there is nothing that the Trump administration can do for Taiwan that will make up for the damage of eradicating the TPP. On the political front, actions that may appear to be intended to lift Taiwan's profile will have little substantive value, but they will have substantial, actual substantive harm. So my recommendation is that U.S. officials need to listen to the leaders in Taiwan about what they believe is in the interest of their country, and they need to believe what they hear. Otherwise, they are treating Taiwan as an object, as a means to their end of challenging the PRC or of changing U.S. policy toward Beijing. U.S. policymakers can change their position on Beijing and on U.S.-China relations. That is the right of the administration. But they cannot do that while claiming to be acting in the interest of Taiwan. That's the overconfidence and wishful thinking part. By poor execution, I mean having a strategy that makes sense, like the phone call between President-elect and President Tsai. I could understand how that could make sense. I could understand the logic of that. So having a strategy that makes sense, that is consonant with Taiwan's interests and is worked out in genuine communication with Taiwan, so no mansplaining to Tsai Ing-wen about what she really needs, or hearing what you want to hear as opposed to what is actually said to you. But poor execution is when that kind of a strategy, which does make sense, is undercut by reckless, thoughtless, irresponsible interventions from someone who has only a rudimentary understanding of the issues and the plan, but happens to hold the world's largest megaphone. So I think Taiwan actually matters to many people in this new administration. I think there are people who genuinely believe that what they are doing is in the interest of Taiwan. But they are in great peril of weaponizing Taiwan as a tool in their struggle against China, and in doing so, they will erase Taiwan's subjectivity and make themselves no different from the Beijing leadership in denying the people of Taiwan the opportunity to be the masters of their own fate. So that is my observations today.
Shelley, thank you so much for those thought-provoking comments.
I'm sorry, that was not that nonpartisan, but I am still a free American. I can still say what I want.
I think nonpartisan in this respect means that we welcome views from all perspectives on either extreme, and we appreciate the fact that you've laid it out so clear. One question I do have, though, is perhaps we can address this later during the, when we open up the floor, is the surprising reaction from Beijing, the muted response from Beijing thus far regarding Taiwan, in that, to put it quite bluntly, that Beijing is acting more predictably and more rationally, almost. But with that, I would like to turn over to Dennis Hickey, and I'm afraid we're a little bit low tech here, so I'm going to have to get this PowerPoint.
Yeah, I've got a clicker here. My students tell me this is the PowerPoint generation. So I always bring a PowerPoint now, but this is a little bit disconcerting because I've got to point this way and then read it up here, but I'll try. Yeah, we're talking about, I'm sorry? That's fine. Taiwan security in an age of insecurity. And I think we can pretty well rush through the introduction of the three pillars of Taiwan security. Basically, military relations with the United States, stable relations with the People's Republic of China, and a formidable military on the island. U.S. security ties with Taiwan are very confusing, they're ambiguous, and they are contradictory. Again, you can read about the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act. I assume most people are familiar with that. We've talked about the communiques. There's also secret assurances from President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, presidential statements, proclamations. It does provide us with a option for arms sales and an option to help Taiwan in an emergency. And I think I'll just move on from there. Also, stable relations with the PRC. They've pushed peaceful unification since the middle 1970s. I might say in my paper, I mentioned that it's prefaced on our adherence to the One China policy. Détente between the two sides from 2008 to 2016. As U.S. officials said at the time, this was one of the few good news stories in world politics. But PRC military buildup has continued during that time. Their economic dependence, meaning Taiwan's, has continued to grow, and of course the PRC's political clout continued to grow. Formidable ROC military, it's remained flat, 2% of GDP, despite the pledges by President Ma and President Tsai to raise it. Very costly shift to all-volunteer force, deep cuts in force levels, inability to attract recruits, low morale, obsolete equipment, and as one U.S. official complained a couple of years ago, we can't defend you if you won't defend yourself. Part two of this focused on the analysis section of the paper about how firm are these three pillars today. So we'll take a look at those. You can probably guess from the image, they don't look real firm. President Obama's actions and policy towards Taiwan were quite laudable if you're in favor of American military support for Taiwan. It's actually part of it's a reflection of a steady trend in U.S. defensive relations with Taiwan since 1979. If there's any trend since we broke relations, it's that we have increased our military cooperation with Taiwan during that period. And this particular president, despite the partisan attacks of some folks on him, has sold a lot of weapons to Taiwan. He's praised Taiwan's diplomatic process, and I mean President Obama here, visa waiver process, new rights for ROC diplomats, and just recently he signed legislation calling for, not requiring, an increase in military contacts. And all through this, they would defend these moves by saying that we are abiding by the One China policy. Well, things have changed. We have President Trump, and an element of uncertainty has been added to the equation. We have the phone call, a lot of different analyses of that and what it portends or what it meant. More amazing was the interview on Fox News Sunday where he said that we're not bound by the One China policy unless we make a deal, okay, on trade or other things, which ranged from North Korea to South China Sea, interesting development. And with that, let's take a look at President Trump and Taiwan now as a pawn. I've argued that it's unlikely that President Trump has any deep affection for Taiwan. I don't know how much knowledge. I suspect I share Shelley's viewpoint that it's not very deep when it comes to Taiwan. He mentioned it, I believe, only once during the campaign, and that was to say that they are stealing American jobs. So it wasn't flattering. And Taiwan does enjoy roughly U.S. $15 billion trade surplus with the U.S. Some people have been happy and pointed to some folks in Heritage and others as advisors and say these are, we're going to upgrade relations with Taiwan because they have links to certain elements in Taiwan, but others do not. And we don't know really what kind of advice, if any, he takes from advisors. He's not a champion of democracy. I have some quotes in my paper with people who are experts in this field saying that if he had won the election, democracy would, the exact quote was, fall off the stage of American foreign policy, the promotion of democracy. And then you get The Art of the Deal, which is his book where he says you come to negotiations with something that the other side really wants. There's an interesting little article I read on the airplane yesterday by, it's in that new Fairbanks Center blog about, that they're going to want more than the status quo with some sort of deal, meaning the PRC. The PRC pillar, all right? President Tsai ignored the warnings by Kuomintang, by her own party like Vice President Liu, by the CCP and others about adherence to the 92 consensus. I differ a little with Shelley that things are on an even keel or relations I think they're not very good. And from what I've heard in Beijing, even before Trump, they said they're not going to get any better. They're going to get worse. They've cut off communications, official communications. They've cut the tourists. They've engineered the lockout of Taipei from the International Civil Avionics Organization. Did I get that right? The new invitation this past year to WHO mentioned the One China policy and the UN withdrawal. Beijing has begun to request that, or accede to request a number of these little diplomatic allies during the diplomatic truce, meaning for the totality of the Ma administration, nobody was allowed to move from, countries from one, that has begun to change. And the WikiLeaks, which I know we all love, were saying a number of years ago that some of these countries, including some of the ones President Tsai has visited, they've asked to switch. And they were told by Beijing, no, okay, during the Ma years. That's changed. Something that caught me by surprise was the move by Nigeria. Not only are you going to having a downgrade in formal relations, the countries with informal relations, like Nigeria, are going to downgrade their informal relations. In other words, Taiwan's unofficial consulate was told to move, and their license plates that have, diplomat or what, those were removed, and other things like that. I hadn't foreseen that. And of course, Beijing had blamed Tsai for the Trump call, calling it a little Taiwan trick. And since that time, things have continued to degenerate with military drills and threats. The ROC pillar, according to polls, 88% of the people in Taiwan believe that the military cannot defend Taiwan. The ROC Ministry of National Defense says they might be able to hold out for a month before the cavalry comes. The DOD has warned recently, like 3 weeks ago, that any U.S. support for Taiwan will be, I put the emphasis there, up to the president, which is true. Okay, the Taiwan Relations Act is not a treaty. Mr. Trump has opposed expensive interventions in civil wars and military operations. He's called on friends and allies of the United States to develop their own defensive capabilities and has labeled those who don't as freeloaders. And most Americans do oppose the use of, military force to defend Taiwan, with only 20-something% supporting it. So conclusions. Taiwan's leaders claim to follow public opinion, but they're evasive when asked which public opinion polls they follow. I read they say they follow many polls, but you can't quite pin them down. Apparently they don't follow them all, but most polls in Taiwan, when I wrote a book on foreign policy making in Taiwan back 2008 or 2007, there's a section in there, if you want to read it, about the nonsense polls that are either intentionally methodologically flawed or unintentionally it's too strong to put the word crackpots up there. Block that out. We should redact that. But think tanks, partisan polls, they're often methodologically flawed. And there is a poll I'd like to draw your attention to that's conducted by the most professional, my understanding, most professional group in Taiwan to do this, the National Election Center, under the auspice of the Asian Studies Program at Duke University. And it's been conducted since 2002, and most recent is from November 2016. And that poll is fascinating. Yeah, I don't care what your political views are, you can find all sorts of things in there, some of which, like any poll, do contradict other parts. But according to that poll, and this was the same last year and the same for I don't know how many years now, 62.67% agree with the proposition that they should have their relations with the mainland under the one China with own interpretation formula. Notice they don't use a trigger word. Trigger word in a poll is something that's going to, people who don't know what it is, they go, oh, it's bad. So they don't say 92 consensus, but that's what the 92 consensus has meant. And a solid majority support it. So I would argue, to help try to ratchet down some of these problems, President Tsai might consider moving towards this or going back to it. It'll restore cross-strait relations, improve the economy, and boost her numbers in the polls, which right now she's got an approval rate of about 28%, which is a pretty steep drop from 70% some time ago. Second, the survey reveals that 70% agree Taiwan is an independent nation, and its name is the Republic of China. So there's no need for further independence. And 82.86% believe a peace agreement should be proposed whereby Taipei pledges not to seek independence and Beijing promises not to attack Taiwan. Now, President Tsai has mentioned in a Wall Street Journal article interview in October, I was very pleased to see her talking about this, about a peace agreement. I think they should push ahead. And as she said, and I've said in other publications, any peace pact must be based on reality. And the reality is that there may be one China, but there are two Chinese governments controlling separate regions of China. This is mainstream opinion in Taiwan, and it is an accurate reflection of reality. There is a Republic of China, and it has existed for over 100 years, and it's time for the PRC to wake up and face reality. I had that in the title of an article. I borrowed that from a Frank Sinatra song, by the way. Step up to reality. A cross-strait peace pact will yield numerous benefits for both sides of the Taiwan Strait, promote peace and stability, and I'd say now is the time for the politicians in the mainland and Taiwan to serve the people. Otherwise, some elements might seek to profit from their differences. So thank you. Those flags both fly at Missouri State University very peacefully. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. We've spent a lot of time now talking about the political and diplomatic as well as security implications of the latest situation regarding U.S. Taiwan relations. But I now want to invite Peter Chow to talk about the economic aspect. And as Shelley said, the United States is withdrawn from pursuing further negotiations on the TPP. So that seems that what Taiwan has really expected to happen is not happening. So the question, hopefully, which you will be able to answer is, where does Taiwan's economic future lie?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Roy and Goto-san, for your invitation to come in here again. All right. do I change the page? Do I have to control? Oh, here. This way, increase. Oh, okay, all right. With the time constraint, I will just summarize my PowerPoint in 3 or 4 sections. And the first part, I talk about the reason in terms of theory and the empirical evidence why Taiwan is a natural trading partner for the United States. Number 2, I will talk about possible U.S. trade policy and what will be his linkage with Taiwan under President Tsai. All right. And number 3, after I talk about that, I hope I have time to get into the agenda that should be put forward for the mutual benefit between Taiwan and the United States. Because I think I don't have time to go over everything, I should elaborate first. Number 1, my humble suggestion as a trade economist is that reciprocal trade liberalization in the U.S. and Taiwan, and also is a bidirectional or a two-way investment for mutual benefit, all right? And number 2 is that currently the TIFA need to be more institutionalized and to have a trade accord, whether you call it FTA or EPA, whatever the term, all right? The statistical everybody can read, Taiwan is the ninth largest U.S. trading partner with 67 billion of the two-way trade. And U.S. export goods and services to Taiwan support an estimate of 217,000 jobs in the United States. I think we should remind President Trump about that. The data is from the Commerce Department. Trade complementarity between Taiwan and the U.S. is the highest, all right? And I have more data on that. So, this is from my book on the U.S. trade with Asian country by the index of the trade complementarity, and Taiwan ranks the highest among many Asian countries. And this is Taiwan's role in the U.S. global supply chain. That is data from OECD and the WTO calculate how the foreign component to the United States global supply chain. The blue star is Taiwan. Excuse me. The blue star is Taiwan, which is almost the sum of the contribution of other Asian countries together to the United States export. One is 1995 and the other is 2009, the recent data available. So Taiwan's contribution to the U.S. global supply chain is greater than the sum of the other Asian countries, all right, such as Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. All right, now President Trump said that you must have a free but a fair trade. And President Trump preferred bilateral to multilateral trade deals. Okay, let's get into that. All right, the U.S.-Taiwan relations, trade relations, some fractions which are manageable, all right? It's not so much on the tariff of on the merchandise trade, but there are some problems on the market access on some specific trade barrier, which are manageable and can be overcome. All right, so if there's a reciprocal trade liberalization and a two-way investment for the mutual benefit, which, will be able to further the U.S.-Taiwan economic relations, all right? U.S. trade deficit is mainly on the merchandise trade. In fact, President Trump did not realize that the U.S. has a tremendous trade surplus on the service trade, All right? Since 2010, U.S. trade surplus in the service trade exceed 700 billion. All right, this is the data from the Commerce Department. The green is the total. The red is the net from the mostly owned by American company, the multinational corporation, and the blue is the cross-border trade in service. And you see that in the last few years, it's over and above 700 billion, right? Which can compensate more than half of the U.S. trade deficit on merchandise trade. Now, why I talk about service trade? Number one, among the Asia countries, Taiwan has the greatest market potential for the U.S. trade service. Number two, Taiwan from itself need to upgrade his service industry to become, the standard of the OECD, right? In other words, Chen, argue that Taiwan need to upgrade its service trade industry to reach the stages and to avoid falling into the so-called middle-income countries trap. Therefore, there's a strong linkage between Trumponomic, if you want to call it, economy and the President Tsai. And then, I will introduce that President Tsai's 5+2. I don't have time to get into that. But there are so many projects. There are plenty room of cooperation between this country for the common interest and co-prosperity. All right. Now, this is the potential, the projection of the global market on the Internet of Things. All right. This is the vision for the Asian Silicon Valley's development plan. Okay. One reservation is that President Tsai said Asia Silicon Valley. One clarification is that the Silicon Valley plan is not to replace the Silicon Valley. It's to Taiwan to serve as a linkage between the Silicon Valley and Asian country. Repeat, this project is to link Silicon Valley in California with Asian country. All right? All right, so you see there's a linkage, a local linkage for Taiwan's local economy, a global linkage with Silicon Valley in California, and a linkage with other Asian countries. And there's a linkage for the future. It's because that Taiwan want to upgrade the industrial structure to become a digitalized economy. All right. And then there are some strategy which I have to say. And of course, there are some bottleneck for Taiwan to develop the ITO. This, the U.S. can help Taiwan to overcome those bottlenecks. All right? And then I also mentioned about the fintech, that there are room of cooperation between Taiwan's financial industry and the U.S. financial industry. All right? This is my own observation, and I humbly suggest that in order to further push for the cooperation of the fintech, a bilateral investment treaty between the United States and Taiwan is essential to move on this project. And then, of course, there are some other area in defense industry. I hope that the U.S. can leave the control of the export of the technology goods or technology to some of the dual use of the military, the defense industry. All right. Now, even the complexity of some of the sensitive issues, such as the market access or the pork import, I will humbly suggest that, we should put the negotiation first rather than to put it as a down payment. All right. In other words, there are some issues which may be a little bit controversial, but we should look at a ground strategy. In other words, for example, the U.S. export of the pork to Taiwan is about 30 million. But the two-way trade is about 63, 65 billions. So the pork is only counted less than 1% in the total two-way trade. All right? So that's my argument, is that U.S. and Taiwan should proceed a further negotiation or even a parallel negotiation rather than to put a specific sector of import as a precondition or down payment. All right, and I use the word, which, somebody may don't like at this moment in Washington, free trade agreement. It could be EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, all right? Any trade deal, of course, is a two-level game. So the political will between Washington and Taipei is the key to reach any conclusion, all right? And I don't have time to get into that. From many of the survey and many of the quantitative analysis, a U.S.-Taiwan trade deal would be a win-win game, all right? The final conclusion is that if we go through detail and put aside those dispute issues, I will say that that the U.S. and Taiwan are on the same boat economically and strategically. And thank you very much.
We actually have about 25 minutes for questions, and we do have a full house. And I want to forfeit my right as a moderator to ask the first question and just go straight to questions from the audience, given that I know that you have a lot of thoughts and comments to share. There is a microphone. If you could please wait for one of my colleagues to come up to you, and then identify yourself and keep your questions fairly brief. And if you could please avoid giving a speech, that would be great. Thank you. The gentleman in the glasses in the red tie, who is not there, that gentleman.
Hi, Eric Gomez from Cato. For Dr. Rigger, I really enjoyed your conception of the relationship as being within guardrails and Taiwan going forward. I was wondering if you could apply that to the phone call that was made between Tsai and President-elect Trump, because was that Tsai trying to push a guardrail out a certain distance? It was a pretty clear break with several decades of precedent of no contact between the president of Taiwan and either a president or president-elect of the United States. So a pretty big event, certainly not as important, I think, as the One China policy, but if you could comment on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. First of all, I think it is important to acknowledge that somebody in Tsai Ing-wen's office might have dialed the phone, but Tsai Ing-wen did not just call Donald Trump out of the blue, right? This event was months in the planning with negotiation to, on both sides, people from her office, people from his office, figuring out that this was a good idea and that they would, that such a phone call would happen. Why did they think it was a good idea? Well, I think for a very good and defensible reason, which is that when it is, as Ambassador Roy explained, for several decades, U.S. presidents have not seen it prudent and within their mandate to have direct communication with the Taiwanese president. So they have to speak to one another through intermediaries whose communications can be, incomplete, et cetera. So I think what the thinking was, certainly on the U.S. side, was if Donald Trump is elected, it will be better for him to have some rapport with and knowledge of Tsai Ing-wen. It may be very difficult for him to gain that rapport and direct communication after inauguration, so this is something that we should do before the inauguration. So I don't think, actually, first of all, if anyone was driving toward the guardrail, it was the U.S., not Taiwan. But I also don't think that it was intended as something that would swerve too close to the guardrail. That would have been if the Trump team had said, okay, after the inauguration, then we'll call Tsai Ing-wen, or we'll have Tsai Ing-wen call us. Instead, I think they thought, as long as we do this before the inauguration, we are within the general parameters of a private citizen speaking to the president of Taiwan. Admittedly, other incoming presidents or presidential aspirants and hopefuls, including Secretary Clinton, had not waited until after the election to make this phone call, right? Secretary Clinton spoke to President Tsai over the summer, right before the election. So it's a little bit different, but it's not a huge stretch. And that's why I would argue the phone call was actually not a problem, or didn't need to be a problem. The phone call became a problem when, first of all, the Trump transition team put it on a list of things that Trump had done that day and sent it to every reporter in America. And I know this because my husband is a reporter whose beat has nothing to do with any of this, but he got this memo every day from the Trump transition team. These are the phone calls Trump made today. And so reporters looking for news to report noticed that this was something unexpected. They reported on it critically, and that provoked Trump to start tweeting. The first tweet he did threw the phone call onto Tsai Ing-wen. In other words, displacing the responsibility for something that had been arranged by both sides onto one side, and giving then the PRC an excuse to blame Tsai and Taiwan. And then he proceeded with two more tweets, which basically dragged Taiwan into conflicts between the U.S. and the PRC that have nothing to do with Taiwan: trade, currency manipulation in the South China Sea. Then he went on to double down with this in the Fox News interview, in which he said that the one China policy is something we can negotiate about. So I don't think the phone call was the problem. I think the problem was Trump's own reaction to the phone call, which was not planned, was not strategic, was, I don't think, part of any serious person in his transition teams thinking about how these events would unfold.
Just to follow up on that logic, so because he was president-elect and he was a private citizen at that time, this was a good overture for him to open up the channel of communication. And what happens if he continues to want to have that channel of communication now that he is in office?
Right, so that is where things get very difficult for the Tsai administration, right? Because the U.S. is Taiwan's primary international friend and supporter. To rebuff the President of the United States is impossible. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the U.S. side to understand the peril that they put Taiwan into when they ask Taiwan to break with established practice and protocol of decades to accommodate this notion that Trump has that, he can talk to whoever he wants to.
Can I add?
Of course.
I wanted to just add a couple observations to this. The Trump phone call, or Tsai phone calls, generate a lot of discussion. one of the things I found interesting was Trump has said that he only knew about this 2 hours before the call. Now, his team may have spent months setting this up, but what he says is that he found out 2 hours before. Now, I don't know if, you can take it if it's true or not. I didn't bring the source with me, but he said it, I believe it was on the Sunday news around that time. A couple other points there is that we don't know if other presidents have had contact, sitting presidents, with presidents of Taiwan or ROC. I wouldn't put it beyond the realm of possibility. The difference is that nobody said anything about it. That's a big difference. Now, we have had former presidents. President Clinton went to Taiwan and gave a speech for a very lucrative check and was out of there. I've got that in an op-ed I wrote. You can cite that. But so we've had former presidents do this. This is a president-elect. He was still a private citizen. Dan Quayle, also former vice president, has been to Taiwan giving speeches. But we've Lee Teng-hui had apparently numerous conversations with the people on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. That all came out after he was president. Of course, President Jiang Jing-kuo had contact with his old classmate, Deng Xiaoping, apparently, when he was in office. So again, the point is, we don't know what what kind of contact really goes. What's really the destabilizing thing here is, as you said, to put this out and make it, and then, in keeping with, I think, his personality, he's very defensive, and so she called me, and I know everything about the one China policy, which I had doubts that he would, but he claimed to. So it's sort of, he dug himself in further and further. So it's like this thing today, if you're watching the news, about the election is rigged, and he wants a recall. What is a recount or investigation? And I am nonpartisan. I did not vote for him or the other person, so I consider myself okay.
Can we just give him one from the stage? Oh, here he comes. He's got it.
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm Mike Fonte. I work as the director of the DPP's office here in Washington. A couple things. First, I think it's very important to underscore what has already been said, which is President Tsai's focus has been to maintain the status quo. She's been cautious and careful in the cross-Strait issue. While there are no official contacts back and forth, it is certainly my understanding that there is communication that goes on. I think you can see that if you look carefully at her inaugural speech, her October 10th speech, and her New Year's speech. Very careful in her language about what she's saying or not saying about the Republic of China Constitution, et cetera. So that's one point. I guess the other point I would say, Dr. Hickey, when you talk about 70% of the people say Taiwan's already independent, I guess you seem to indicate that that was as if that was something different than where the DPP was going to push it further. DPP's position is, yes, Taiwan's independent. Yes, we already are a sovereign independent country. Don't need to have a change in that status unless people want to do that. In my mind, that leaves all options open. So that leaves open the option of a unification if possible, independence if possible, or continued status quo. So I think there's a number of points there where we would discuss at greater length. And I guess I'd also point you to the Taiwan Indicator Survey Research polling, which seems to me to be a lot more mainstream than some of the partisan polling that you mentioned. So, and finally, maybe one question for Ambassador Roy. The one China, two governments question. I don't think the Chinese would accept that. I don't think the DPP would accept that either, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's a non-starter. I referred to the French establishment of diplomatic relations. De Gaulle was exploring that option. That's one of the reasons why he didn't officially recognize the Beijing as the sole legal government of China. He was keeping up the option to see if there was a way to get closer to a two-government recognition position. It was definitively shot down by Beijing. And I would say that the French establishment in '64 occurred at a time when, as I mentioned, Beijing was still exploring the best way to try to enhance its international standing. They were firmly committed to a one-China approach, but they hadn't locked it in as solidly as it later became locked in. And by the 60s and 70s, by the end of the 60s and the 70s, there was no more flexibility in their position on the question. Even then, there wasn't the flexibility on the question of the one China policy. It was a question of whether or not you insisted that there had to be included in the communique a reference to the recognizing the sole legal government of China.
Can I add to that? I think that it is possible that something could happen like that in the future. I was in Beijing several months before President Ma met with President Xi, and I was told this is impossible. It can't happen. You have to overcome the sovereignty issue, and they can't do it. It happened. I think the mainland's think tanks have been studying this issue for I don't know how many years now, at least 5, 6, 7, or 8. Nothing's come of it, but they have been trying to figure out some way to do something like this. So you've had scholars here at Brookings from the mainland who have made these arguments and have made pretty convincing ones. So I think some progress is there. And as far as I recognize DPP's position. I'm not knocking it as far as the status of Taiwan. I've even had people from FAPA tell me that they're perfectly fine if there can be an ROC, PRC. I think, in two governments within one China, which is an interesting idea. So I think it's a possibility. I think it's worth trying.
Gentleman standing patiently by the pillar.
Thank you very much. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. Taiwanese people right now are concerned about the possibility that Taiwan may become the bargaining chip for the negotiation between US and China. And some people said if the United States did not assure Beijing that it will continue one China policy, maybe China would not accept the new ambassador from the United States. But yesterday, I asked this question to Chinese ambassador here, and he said he didn't see this kind of situation. So my question is, how possible that the United States, China, will not fight with Trump administration directly, but punish Taiwan? And what kinds of the worst scenario that might happen if Trump administration did not clarify the one China policy? Thank you.
So I think that's a really great question. There are several parts to it. Just a couple of thoughts. One is that a conversation that I have heard from mainland China going around in Beijing is, look, if the U.S. blows up the foundation of U.S.-China relations and the PRC has to do something very active to stabilize its one China principle, this catastrophe is on the hands of the U.S., not China, right? So the U.S., by by undermining and refusing to engage on the basis of one China could provide a kind of pretext for very serious action against Taiwan. This is something that people in Beijing are thinking about. Who would be blamed in this scenario? Maybe not the PRC. That's one thing. Another thing that I think is very interesting is when I first heard that, when I first heard the Fox News interview in which Donald Trump said that he did not see any reason to subscribe to the one China principle if he didn't get something back from the PRC. And I saw that as making Taiwan policy, and therefore Taiwan, a bargaining chip in U.S.-China relations. And my first thought was the PRC should be happy to hear this, right? There are many things that they could offer Donald Trump that might be, to his mind, worth Taiwan. This is why I am heartened and encouraged by the very firm statement made repeatedly, including this morning by Lu Gang. One China principle is not negotiable. In other words, the PRC does not want to enter into this negotiation. They don't want to get Taiwan through some kind of devil's bargain with the U.S. So everyone here, Tsai Ing-wen is standing firm with her status quo, not reaching out to grab the shiny object that's being dangled here. And the PRC is also not jumping at the opportunity to make gains in a kind of abnormal way. So the other parties seem to me to be behaving responsibly. It's incumbent on the U.S. to follow suit.
Hi, Ray Burkhart, longtime Taiwan watcher. I know we're not supposed to give speeches, but I'll keep it short. Just listening to all this discussion about the one China policy and the one China principle, I think it's important to note that Beijing uses the term one China principle. We never use that term. We use one China policy. We make clear that our policy is different than their principle. And the main difference, Stape alluded to it, was that we acknowledged that both sides of the strait believed that there was only one China, but we didn't recognize it. And what that means, more importantly, what that means is, and more relevant for current situation, is that we've always been clear that we don't take a position on the ultimate political status of Taiwan. This means that we, to put it another way, more importantly, we have never taken the position that the only possible outcome is unification. Independence, the perpetuation of the status quo are also possible outcomes. So in that sense, the U.S. one China policy has never been totally acceptable to Beijing. It's always been something that they found very lacking. Perhaps some of these subtleties were not carefully explained to President-elect Trump. But the irony here, of course, is that the actual position is probably not as bad as he thought it was, which may also provide some way of getting out of this problem.
Can I just confuse the waters a little bit more? With respect to the one China policy and the one China principle, which are used interchangeably, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but I'm going to just say, according to my understanding, it's always been that one China policy is that you recognize one China. You pick Beijing or Taipei. There's one, you can't. One China principle is that there is one China, and Xinjiang, Tibet, Taipei, Taiwan, they're all part of it. But you see it in the press everywhere interchangeably, and it just adds to the confusion, and I thought I would add to the confusion.
And in fact, the U.S. has often, over the years, had quarrels with the UN Secretariat and various UN agencies for using language defining Taiwan's position as part of the PRC in ways that we don't accept.
Yeah, you're right.
We have
time for one last question. The gentleman here.
Yeah, my name is Norman Fu, former correspondent of the China Times of Taiwan. I want to take advantage of Mr. Roy, Ambassador Roy's long-time experience in China. He has served both in Taiwan and PRC. He was actually one of the negotiators for the normalization. My question is very simple. What do you think of the eventual fate of Taiwan as a China long-time observer? My own personal view is that I'm very pessimistic from a historical point of view. You know, in 1683, Emperor Kangxi launched the invasion and conquered Taiwan, which was run then by the grandson of Koxinga, Zheng Chenggong. And in 1895, after Taiwan was ceded to the Japanese under the Shimonoseki Treaty, the Taiwan leadership then declared independence. But that independence lasted less than a month. I saw the flag just last month at the Taiwan museum,
Okay.
and they all fled back to China. I'm afraid eventually when China, grows strong enough militarily, I don't think the U.S. can repeat the 1996 example of sending to, the air carriers to try to stop the Chinese from intimidating Taiwan.
Thank you
And
for your
by
question.
then, I'm afraid.
Stape, would
Okay,
you like to answer
so,
that? The fate of Taiwan,
Yeah, so
Taiwan's destiny.
let me repeat the questions.
Well, I understand the
Personal
question.
observation of the eventual fate of Taiwan.
I can't answer your question in the sense I don't know what the future is going to bring. What I do know is this. Ambassador Burkhart made a very important point. We don't prejudge what the outcome will be. That's why our position, which some of our presidents have actually violated because they haven't been briefed properly, is we don't oppose independence. We don't oppose unification, because that would be putting an American judgment as to what the outcome should be. Since our position has always been that the outcome is to be worked out peacefully by the two sides of the strait, therefore we say we don't support independence, we don't support unification, because that's up to the Chinese to resolve. It's important for Taiwan, in my judgment, to keep control of the process. And I use an example which the Taiwanese don't like, which is don't Cubanize yourself. Cubanizing yourself means that you mishandle your relationship with the great big continental power next to you, to whom geographically your prosperity and security is indelibly linked. And you become totally dependent on military support from a distant power that has its own interests. That's what Cuba did to itself. Cuba's prosperity ultimately rests on having a good relationship with the United States. They ended up totally dependent on the Soviet Union, and therefore they're not prosperous the way they could be. Taiwan at the moment has control of that issue, but they can't ensure their security entirely through arms sales now, because the PRC is going to be militarily too powerful for Taiwan to be able to maintain the type of balance that you've been able to maintain before. They can be strong enough so that the military option for the mainland is a dangerous one. But they can handle the risk through their management of the cross-Strait relationship. then they're not simply dependent on judgments by Washington, but they can calibrate the risk. And we have seen under President Ma that they were able to make enormous strides forward in the economic sphere, because when Beijing is confident of where Taiwan stands in terms of pushing for independence, then they're prepared to give more international space to Taiwan, and they're prepared to have a meeting between the political leaders on each side, which many people would have thought would have been impossible under other circumstances. So the danger of some of the people who are advocating relooking at the one China policy, selling more arms, bringing Taiwan back into our defense perimeter in the Western Pacific, is that's taking away Taiwan's freedom of action. They will no longer control the risk because the United States is taking that over. And then they lose control of the process. I think that would be extraordinarily damaging for Taiwan in the future. It's much better for them to recognize that the way to ensure that they have potential options in the future is to manage the risk so that you don't have a crisis.
Okay, well, alas, the time has come for us to go our separate ways. I hope that before we say goodbye, you will join me in thanking our speakers who have traveled far. I should also point out that I have asked Shelley, Peter, and Dennis to submit essays regarding their presentation. We will be producing a publication based on that, and hopefully we will have it ready for you to read by the end of February or early March. So again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank